Good evening, and welcome back to the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we step away from the clamor of our noisy present and sink, deliberately and slowly, into the hush of an ancient past. Make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Allow the day's edges to blur. We begin with a study in endurance, an obligation at once banal and terrifying. The long, patient vigilance of Rome's Vestal virgins. When we picture Rome, we think of legions, oratory, marble triumphs, and thunderous spectacle. And yet the city's survival, its sense of order and sanctity, was quietly anchored to something far smaller and far steadier. A domestic flame, the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of hearth and home, was no mere symbol. It was civic lifeblood. If that fire went out, the omens were bad. The safety of the res publica itself could be read in the persistence of those embers. Into that responsibility stepped a handful of women, chosen as children, usually between 6 and 10 years old, plucked from patrician houses. For their families, it was a distinct honor. For the girls themselves, it was a life Their service lasted 30 years, a single unbroken contract with ritual precision. 3 decades partitioned into 3 10-year cycles. The first decade was schooling, slow, exhaustive absorption of prayers, gestures, and rules. The second decade was performance, the execution, again and again, until motion and meaning fused. The final decade was pedagogy, teaching the next cohort to repeat the same ritual choreography in the same exacting way. 30 years of repetition. 30 years of disciplining both mind and body to the smallest detail. The Atrium Vesta, a secluded, marble-bounded compound tucked beside the pulse of the Roman Forum, was where this quiet life was staged. The setting was elegant. The work was not. Dawn found the Vestals awake before the city's rumble, carrying out the first and most sacred inspection, ensuring the fire had not dimmed overnight. This was not casual housekeeping. The ritual of drawing water from the Fons Vesta was framed by rules that made the ordinary feel uncanny. Clay vessels only steps taken, so that no shadow fell upon the holy water movements, conducted with a restraint bordering on asceticism. Cleaning the temple was rich. Sweeping was not simply removal of dust, it was purification. A slow, measured choreography with straw brooms whose strokes mattered as much as any spoken invocation. The day's task list reads like a manual of deliberate slowness: tend the flame, prepare ritual food, memorise liturgis, keep the temple spotless. The pace was quiet, almost monastic, not for efficiency, but for sanctity. Every action required attention so absolute that the possibility of error became an existential weight. One of their most mundane and strangely intimate labors was making the molla salsa, the salt, toasted spelt used to season nearly every public sacrifice. Imagine toasting grain until it reaches a precise color, grinding salt to an exact, coarse texture, combining them in silence, day after day. The point was not productivity, but ritual perfection. A repetitive labor transformed into a kind of spiritual craftsmanship. To the Romans, the smallest slippage, a mispronounced formula, a grain improperly toasted, a moment of vanity, could be read as a crack in the city's favor with the gods. The Vestals thus lived under a constant, quiet pressure. Their perfection was the Republic's protection. And yet the Vestals' power was ambiguous. They were some of the few women with public, sacred duties. They could intervene in legal matters in rare instances, and their chastity was legally enforced as if it were a matter of state security. But within their cloistered authority lay an unrelenting demand for emotional and personal suppression, the psychological cost of that lifelong surveillance of one's gestures. Words, even the possibility of a misstep, is a story of human constraint wrapped in an undeniably sacred cloak. From Rome's candlelit silence we drift across deserts and seas to the monumental sun-baked precision of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Here the axis of power shifts. Where Rome's anxiety gathered around a flame, Egypt's revolved around numbers, measurement, accounting, and the slow erosion of trust as bureaucracy swelled. The organization of the Nile SA annual bounty, the entire calculus of who eats and who pays, turned on the meticulous work of scribes. The Old Kingdom's stability depended on Ma at the cosmic order. But in practice, it ran through ledges. Scribes measured the height of the flood, calculated the acreage of fields, estimated the yield, and used those measures to determine tax obligations to the living god king. Precision was the virtue that sustained a civilization. The reed pen, the papyrus scroll, the rule-governed stroke, these were instruments of civilization. And yet precision can be a double-edged sword. The more exacting the measurement, the more avenues it provides for subtle corruption. A coaxed miscalculation here, an altered entry there, small manipulations of numbers allowed the powerful to siphon wealth. What looks like abstract arithmetic becomes moral geography. Who controls the numbers controls the food. When scribal exactitude turns deceptive, the machinery that once guaranteed order metamorphoses into a mechanism of extraction. The poor, whose survival depended on fair accounting of flood and field, were suddenly vulnerable to the quiet theft of a few altered signs and columns. So we have two different ancient terrors. In Rome, the terror of ceremonial lapse, the fear that a single extinguished ember could signal divine wrath. In Egypt, the terror of institutional rot, the knowledge that a ledger's subtle corruption could starve a people. Both civilizations teach us something about how societies anchor themselves, one through attention to the sacred, and the other through the sanctity of numbers. Both required human agents to act, day after day, in ways that seemed at once painfully small and cosmically consequential. Sit with that for a moment. Consider the Vestal sweeping the marble stones until her hands knew every grain. Picture the scribe bending low to papyrus by lamplight, fingers stained with ink, while the after-flood sun glared over the fields. Their tasks were, in their respective cosmologies, what held the world together. Tiny rituals of persistence that, taken together, sustained entire political orders. Tonight's lesson is not about nostalgia for ritual or condemnation of bureaucracy. It is an invitation to notice where our present world hinges on the patient repetition of small acts. The unsung custodians, the clerks, the caregivers, the technicians. Ancient Rome and Old Kingdom Egypt give names and forms to that truth. They remind us that grand narratives of power always rest on the habitual, often tedious labors of the few. When you leave this quiet corner of history, carry one last image. The slow, steady flame still burning in a temple, and titin blacked, reed pen lying where it was set down. Both are instruments of endurance, fragile, human, and utterly indispensable. Good night. We stand now inside the humming heart of ancient Egypt's administrative apparatus, far from the pyramid spectacle and the pharaoh's staged magnificence. Here power is quiet, papered, or rather, papiered, and absolute, because it is measured. The principle that ordered the world mot, cosmic balanced, found its everyday expression in numbers, columns, and the small, precise marks of a reed pen. And no one translated math into practice more effectively or more dangerously than the scribe. A scribe was not merely a clerk. He belonged to an educated elite who were exempt from the backbreaking labor of the fields and elevated by literacy into a zone of practical authority. His craft was hieratic, the cursive cousin of hieroglyphs, adapted for speed and daily use. His other tool was arithmetic, simple in principle, but vital in application. When the Nile swelled and receded, when the sun, rain, and river conspired to decide who would eat, it was the scribe's mesomenstaken ad Nile, recorded on papyrus, that translated the flood into rupees of grain, into obligations and privileges. He walked daily to measuring stations, ink-stained fingers tallying water levels and converting those numbers into yield estimates. Small, repetitive work, monumental consequences. From this bureaucratic meticulousness emerged a particular kind of crimes, patient, invisible, what we might call the sin of the ledger. It was not the brazen theft of a brick, it was arithmetic, weaponized into discretion. Picture a district tax office. The tax scribe bent over receipts, the granary overseer supervising the flow of grain into state bins. Their tasks were monotonous, ritualized: record incoming crops, calculate the dues, reconcile the totals. On paper, everything looked perfect. The columns added up. The seals were intact. But between the lines, Small acts of falsification accrued like sediment. Surveying was the first opening. After the flood, the scribe paced the fields, measured strips of earth, and entered figures into the royal register. A deliberate, minimal underreporting, calling 5 acres 4.5, createth a phantom acreage, land that did not officially exist, but bore a full harvest. That phantom hafakaresio could be quietly diverted to the nomarch's private store or parceled out among complicit officials. No dramatic raid, no raised swords, just a fraction of a field missing from the ledger. A second vector was the granary itself. Farmers came bearing baskets of grain. Officials supervised the transfer from basket to massive store bin. The trick was microscopic. Subtly larger receiving baskets, nominally full measures, that were in fact under scales adjusted by a fraction. Across thousands of deliveries in a season, that tiny skew aggregated into an enormous hidden surplus. The recorded entry in the ledger matched the official procedure. In reality, the state collected less than the papyrus claimed. What made this corruption elegant and devastating was its invisibility. An auditor comparing tax tallies to land registries might see no mismatch. The arithmetic held, the deceit lived in disciplined deception. Perfect precision used to manufacture falsity. For local administrators, it was sometimes a survival strategy. Central authority could be slow, irregular, or absent. Local officials faced real pressures, paying retainers, provisioning troops, funding monuments, or simply maintaining their households in lean years. The sin of the ledger created a parallel economy, a shadow flow of resources that compensated for the dysfunction of a distant center. The tools of order, the reed pen, the nilometer, the granary ledger were thus repurposed into instruments of extraction. Step back and consider the moral geometry of this bureaucracy. The same rituals of measurement that legitimized the state also provided the technique for its undermining. The scribe, a custodian of mat on one hand, could be its greatest saboteur on the other. The quiet arithmetic of everyday administration made possible a prolonged, structural theft that left the visible mechanics of state intact while hollowing its substance. We leave the dry, grain-scented air of Egyptian storehouses and cross centuries and continents to land in the far more ostentatious theater of 17th-century European courts, where status was not counted in bushels but displayed in hair. Enter the periwig, an extravagant, often grotesque symbol of aristocratic power that turned vanity into a full-time occupation. The periwig was more than it was a social engine, fashioned from human hair, horsehair, or sometimes the wig's more ignoble substitutes. It required artisanal time, hefty expense, and a retinue of attendants. To wear a periwig properly was to make a statement. You had resources to spare, servants to tend to you, and a public life built on conspicuous maintenance. The hair was powdered copiously using starches and perfumes to achieve the pale, matte look prized by the elite. The process involved hours of curling, setting, padding, and nailing the structure into place with pins and pastes that could crack and flake. Wigs were often scented to mask odors, sanitation standards being what they were, and were sometimes infested with lice, making their upkeep not merely time-consuming but unpleasant. Maintaining such a headpiece demanded staff, wigmakers to craft and shape, valets to powder and position, and chambermaids to store and preserve. A nobleman's morning routine might include a small choreography of dressing that began not with shirt and coat, but with the setting of the wig, an act of performative identity that signaled status before any words were spoken. The wig's size, style, and ornamentation signaled rank and party allegiance. It could be a weapon in social negotiation. Courts became theaters of hair as much as conversation, and like the sin of the ledger, the periwig system reproduced inequalities through ritual. The time and labor invested in these absurd constructs were visible proof of wealth and leisure. They also produced an economy of supporting industries. Starchers, wigmakers, and powder merchants benefited from the aristocracy's vanity. The elaborate hair created dependence, not just aesthetic, but economic and political. To be of the court was to be bound to its strange demands, and each powdered curl tightened that bond. Across these vignettes from reed pens in Egyptian archives to powdered periwigs in the halls of Europe, one pattern or whose institutions create habits, and habits create specializations. Specializations create power, and power seeks either to preserve the public good or to subvert it for private ends. The small, repetitive acts of daily life, measuring a field, filling a granary, sweeping a temple floor, setting a wig, are not trivial. They are the sinews of political life. They can uphold cosmic order, or they can be used to reroute its benefits to a chosen few. So linger on the image of the scribe dipping his reed in ink, the faint scratch of figures recording the Nile's mood. Imagine the supervisor lifting a grain basket, and the tiny, unremarked gap between measure and reality. Picture the valet's hands dusting powdered starch across an aristocrat's wig as conversation and court intrigue swirl around them. These are small gestures, repeated endlessly, that give shape to empires and to decline. The mechanics of power are often quiet and frequently mundane, but their consequences echo across centuries. Keep that in your mind as the lights dim on this particular corridor of history. Not the grand gesture, but the meticulous habit. Not the blow of the sword, but the steady hand that writes, measures, and styles the world into being. We leave behind the scorched sands and the weary arithmetic of ancient Egypt, and we drift almost 4,000 years ahead into the damp, perfumed, and extravagantly self-conscious salons of 17th century Europe. The struggle for survival has changed form. It is no longer about the sacred tending of a flame or the precise measurement of a flood. It is now about a new kind of ritual and absurd, expensive and strangely hypnotic act of self-maintenance, the art of wearing the perruque, known in France as the perruque. The perruque was not simply a piece of fashion, it was an institution born of vanity, disease, and the political theater of appearance. Its unlikely origin lay in the private insecurities of two kings, Louis XIV of France, whose youthful curls began to abandon him before his 20th year, and Charles II of England, whose illnesses robbed him of his once enviable hair. Both men, desperate to project vitality and godlike authority, turned to artifice, and like everything royal, the imitation soon became the standard. What began as a disguise quickly evolved into a uniform of power. The grand periwigs of the era were immense stowering, shoulder-length constructions of curls that cascaded like waterfalls of artifice. They transformed frail monarchs into visual deities. Every nobleman, bureaucrat, and aspiring courtier followed suit. To wear one was to declare two things without speaking. First, that you had the wealth to afford such an object of pure vanity, and second, that you had the servants and leisure required to endure the torture of keeping it in pristine condition. The material reality of these wigs was far from elegant. The finest perruques were made not from the wearer's own hair, but from that of others, most often poor rural women who sold their long locks for a few coins. The best, however, used horsehair or goat hair, tougher and more resilient under the curling tongs. These strands were then laboriously woven, curled, and set onto a fine linen or silk foundation by the perruquerie specialist artisan, whose skill determined a man his social fate. The making of a single grand perruque could take weeks, each curl steamed, pinned, and powdered into immaculate artificiality. Yet owning one was only the beginning. The true ordeal began with its maintenance. A periwig was not a garment. It was an ongoing performance. It demanded servants, tools, powders, and patience. Every morning began not with prayer or breakfast, but with preparation, the silent duel between vanity and decay. The most iconic element of the wig was its color, the pale, powdered white or gentle gray that came to signify cleanliness, refinement, and superiority. This effect was achieved through the liberal application of wig powder, a fragrant, choking dust made from ground starch, sometimes mixed with flour, plaster of Paris, or orris root for scent. To apply it required its own ritual. The gentleman would retreat into a small enclosed chamber aptly called a powder room. His valet or barber, armed with a bellows or large puff, would dust the wig until every curl gleamed with artificial frost. To protect his lungs and finery, the master donned a mask and cape, standing motionless as clouds of white powder filled the air. The process was repeated daily, sometimes several times a day. The aristocratic household coated in a perpetual haze of starch dust, like a snowstorm that never melted. But beneath this powdered mask of elegance, a hidden horror festered. Hygiene in the 17th century was rudimentary at best, and the dense, humid structure of these wigs made them perfect havens for lice and fleas. Beneath the curls, a warm, dark ecosystem thrived. The constant itching gave rise to another curious invention. The wig scratcher, along slender rod of ivory or silver, discreetly employed to scratch the scalp beneath the wig, without the indignity of touching one's head in public. The daily battle against infestation was another grim duty of the servant class. Each evening, the wig would be removed, shaken out, and subjected to fumigation. Oils, vinegar, and mercury-based solutions were brushed through the hair to kill the vermin, filling the air with a suffocating metallic stench. It was slow, repetitive work, done in silence, a ritual of domestic misery performed to preserve the illusion of aristocratic grace. And then there was the weather. A pair of wig's worst enemy was rain. A sudden drizzle could instantly dissolve the delicate starch powder into sticky white paste. Curls collapsed, pomades melted, and the once majestic creation drooped into a bedraggled, dripping mess. The nobleman who might once have commanded troops or dictated treaties could, at the first hint of a darkening sky, be found sprinting toward shelter, clutching his artificial mane like a frightened child. The wig's tyranny extended far beyond fashion. It was a regime, the endless cycle of curling, powdering, perfuming, fumigating, and repairing consumed not just the body, but the hours and discipline of everyone involved. For the wearer, it was a tax on comfort and sanity. For the servants, the valets, the perruquiers, the barbers, it was an occupation built entirely on someone else's vanity. Together, they formed a miniature bureaucracy of absurdity, a daily administration of appearance that paralleled the vast bureaucracies of empire and court. To neglect one's wig was to invite social death. An unpowdered peruke could undo a reputation faster than scandal. To appear disheveled in court was to signal decline, to betray weakness, poverty, or, worse, rebellion against the rigid code of appearances that governed the age. And so, through sheer habit and fear of ridicule, men enslaved themselves to these monuments of hair. The irony was exquisite. The periwig, born from the insecurity of kings, became a visible chain of servitude for the elite. It turned power into performance, grace into maintenance, dignity into a delicate balancing act of powder and pride. What began as concealment for boldness became a vast theater of conformity, a kind of social uniform that all pretended to love and all secretly loathed. Thus, the periwig age was not truly an age of fashion, but of rich livery bits, as repetitive, as sacred, and as exhausting as the duties of the Vestal virgins or the Egyptian scribes. The tools had changed. The broom became the curling iron, the sacred flame became the powder puff, the ledger replaced by the mirror. Yet beneath all these transformations, the same human truth remained, the longing to appear perfect in the eyes of others, and the endless, weary labor required to maintain that illusion. And so, within the candlelit halls of Versailles and the smoky corridors of Whitehall, men performed their daily rites of vanity. Powder fell like snow upon velvet. Perfumes clashed with sweat and starch, and mirrors reflected faces that were both magnificent and absurd. The world had changed, yet humanity had not. The periwig was not just a fashion, it was a quiet, powdered monument to our ancient obsession with control, image, and the fragile theater of dignity. We step into the powdered fog of the 17th century morning, where a nobleman's day begins not with thought or prayer, but with preparation, an elaborate, humiliating performance centered on a single, absurd artifact. What do you think of his vanity here is actually a slow bureaucratic ritual of survival, and its speciest official is not the lord himself, but his valet, the intimate custodian of his master's dignity and disgrace. The valet's dawn begins at the wig stand. Overnight, the peruke rests on a carved wooden block, sculpted to hold every calculated curl. By morning, it must be inspected like a small, delicate siege engine. The first duty is diagnosis. Check for loosened tresses, broken stitching, traces of vermin, or the faint collapse of last night's Anything less than immaculate invites mockery at court. Anything cracked or sagging is a social wound that will not heal. Next comes restyling. A patient, excruciating choreography. Curls that held their shape in the heat of stage lights and the hush of anterooms will have sagged or frizzed in sleep. The valet takes up small curling tongs heated over a low flame and sets to work, curl by curl, hour after hour. Each twist must be precise. One misplaced coil, and the entire face presented to the world becomes a floating joke. This is tedious, exacting labor, the sort that turns human hands into instruments of aesthetic tyranny. Once the curls are obedient, the wig is lacquered with pomatum, a greasy, fragrant compound of animal fat, resin, and perfume. Pomatum binds the shape and masks the less fashionable odors that cling to flesh in an age when bathing is not common. Too much grease, and the wig droops with shame. Too little, and the powder won't hold. The valet becomes a chemist and an artist, balancing musk against ambergris, against lavender, applying each smear with the precision of someone tending a fragile, living thing. Then comes the powdering, the ritual coronation of the process. Powder is foundational. To the periwigs, meaning whitened hair signifies cleanliness, leisure, and rank. The application is theatrical. The master retreats into a powder room, while the valet, puff in hand or bellows at the ready, fills the air with clouds of starch. The gentleman dons a cape, and sometimes a mask to keep the white inferno out of his lungs and clothes. Powder falls everywhere, into lace collars, onto velvet sleeves, across the polished floor, leaving a soft, artificial snowfall in its wake. It is beautiful, embarrassing, and inherently dangerous. Dust is highly flammable, and anyone leaning too near a candle risks a flash of ignominious combustion. But the performance doesn't end at dawn. A noble's life is public and mobile. Wig crises can occur anywhere. Travel, wind, rain, smoke from hearths, or torches, all are existential threats to the peruke. Thus the valet carries, like a soldier guarding a relic, a heavy wig box to every journey. Arriving at a banquet or council, the valet slips away to a corner with his master's executing quick touch-ups. A brisk shake, a hurried recurl, another dusting of powder. These tiny maintenance rituals happen in the margins of power behind screens, beneath tables, so that the public face remains immaculate. Every element of this regimen exposes the era's brittle anxieties. A stray curl or a visible lice scratch is not a trivial mistake. It is a social indictment. It signals slovenliness, decline, or, worst of all, an inability to command servants who keep up appearances. The nobility's waking hours, ostensibly devoted to governance and leisure, are thus consumed by an endless, repetitive campaign of image management. Vanity, in this context, is not frivolous but existential. Survival in the court requires constant cosmetic warfare, and the human economy that sustains this cosmetic state is telling. The peruke is built on the labor of many. Rural women who sold their hair, perukers who wove the tresses, valets who endured the stink and the monotony, and perfumers and powder merchants who profited from the dependency of the elite. The social order, then, reproduces itself through ritualized maintenance. Appearance begets employment, which enforces appearance. The periwig is both emblem and engine of that system. We leave the powdered halls and the valet's weary hands and re-enter the darker air of ancient Rome. This time for the Vestals and their most terrible contingency, the campus. For 30 years, the Vestal virgins lived under a strict regime of ritual and silence. Their every breath an offering to the sacred flame. But beneath their disciplined days lay a threat unlike any other. The possibility of sexual transgression. To violate a Vestal's chastity was not a private sin. It was an offense that endangered the state's pact with the gods. The Campus Cellaretista, a cursed field, was both place and punishment in the Roman imagination. If a Vestal broke her vow, the crime was framed as a wound of the Republic itself, a rupture in the sacred fabric that held Rome's fortune together. The penalty was as public and as slow as their service had been private. A solitary death, buried alive, within the confines of ritual formality. The condemned Vestal was led to a small underground chamber with a loaf of bread, and a small jar of water, tokens of a death that was meant to look orderly, if not merciful. The act was ritualized, legal, and designed to preserve the city's purity by removing the transgressor's living presence. This was the ultimate terror for the Vestal. A life of obsessive discipline capped by the slow, procedural erasure of their personhood, while their labor keeping the flame, preparing the mola salsa. Sweeping the temple was public religion. The punishment for rupture was a solitary, bureaucratic extinguishing. In both Rome and Versailles, in Egypt's granaries and the peruke-studded salons of Europe, the pattern is the same. Societies build rituals to secure authority, and rituals generate mechanisms to police and preserve themselves, whether by powder puff or by a reed pen's tiny, dishonest stroke. The mundane arts of maintenance are the backbone of power and also its weakest flank. We step back into the high, grave world of Roman religion away from powder and pomatumware. Privilege and terror were braided together into a single, immovable fate. The Vestal Virgins occupied one of the strangest political-theological positions in human history, clothed with honors that severed them from ordinary family authority, given public escorts and legal privileges, yet bound by a single non-negotiable obligation. Their purity was not private virtue. It was the city's talisman. The flame of Vesta burned as a civic guarantor, and the Vestals were its living custodians. To violate that custody was, in De Roman's eyes, to invite the gods' displeasure upon the entire race. This is where privilege ends and dread begins. In Cestum, the violation of a Vestales vow was treated not as a mere crime, but as a rupture in the civic fabric, a spiritual contagion whose consequences could ripple outward as famine, military failure, and civic collapse. The penalty was correspondingly extreme and ritualized. Burial alive. The logic of the penalty is precise in its cruelty. Roman law forbade the direct slaying of a Vestal by human hands, so the state crafted a legal fiction of interment with provisions. The condemned Vestal would be sealed away so that her death would appear an act of the gods or a consequence of solitude, not cold-blooded execution by men. The mechanics of condemnation are as ceremonial as the office itself. The indictment was presented before the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Pontiffs, witnesses, whether motivated by piety, personal animus, or political calculations, spoke. In a chamber where the stakes were cosmic. Once found guilty, the woman was publicly stripped of her sacred vestments, the suffabulum that draped her shoulders, and the senicrins, those elaborate six-braided coiffures that announced her sanctity, were taken from her, replaced with coarse, dark wool, the robe of the dead. In that symbolic undressing, she ceased to be a living emblem and became mortal accusation. The procession to the Campus Illeratus was itself a ritualized erasure, carried on a plain wooden litter. The condemned Vestal was escorted through the city in a silence the law demanded. No weeping, no murmured petitions. The Colline Gate receded behind them. The Forum's noise did not follow. This silence was part of the punishment and part of the remedy. The city physically removed the stain of sacrilege and attempted to contain its contagion through solemn invisibility. At the Field of the Wicked, the cell waited low, equipped only with a small loaf, a vessel of water, and a cup of milk. These supplies were legalistic gestures, a grotesque compliance with statute that allowed the state to say it had not killed the Vestal but merely provided for her while the gods took their course. Then the final act. The lowering into darkness, the sealed stone, the piled earth. The Pontifex Maximus intoned one last prayer, a ritual partition of the impure from the civic body. To the Roman mind, it was purification by removal, a terrible, legally sanitized excision intended to restore Vesta's favor. For the woman, a life of exaltation and austerity, punctured by silence and annihilation. Ita was the most absolute form of social death. 30 years of ritual vigilance, 3 decades of learning, performing, and teaching the rites carried with it the knowledge of what small slippages could demand. The fear of the Campus Illeratus was a psychological instrument. It compressed the possibility of rare transgression into a constant background hum, enforcing perfection in the minutiae of daily devotion. The Vestal's lived experience, then, was not merely liturgy. It was a long apprenticeship in living under existential risk. From this austere Roman corridor we travel again back through time and across cultus too, another kind of religious custodianship, the cloistered, candlelit labor of the medieval monastic scribe. The stakes in these monasteries were different, but no less consequential. There was no threat of burial by law for a slipped stroke of the quill. There was instead the slow, relentless danger of error, of neglect, of cultural oblivion. The monk scribe's duty was preservation, where armies fell silent and cities Scriptoria kept the lines of memory lit. A scribe's day was measured in marginalia and minute rulings. In winter's cold as summer's dim light, hunched before a wooden desk, he copied the works that would shape future centuries. Scripture, patricit commentary, legal codes, and, in rarer hours, fragments of ancient poetry or scientific treatise. The work was technically demanding. Parchment had to be prepared and ruled. Inks mixed to exact shades on shields, and later scripts formed with disciplined regularity so that page after page would read as seamless continuity rather than the product of a single. Fagible and monastic copying was repetition elevated to a vocational ethic. Each letter had to be precise, because a single blunder could propagate into theological confusion or scholarly misdirection for generations. Correcting mistakes was possible scraping parchments, reinscribing lines, but tedious and risky. The scribe learned to see text as a landscape to be navigated, to measure spaces and line lengths, to plan initials and illuminations, all while keeping his hand steady and his eye mercilessly critical. The labor was both ascetic and artistic, a test of patience, eyesight, and humility. Beyond the mechanics, there was another slow adversary: boredom and fatigue. The scribe's life was solitary and cyclical. The candle burned down. The quill grew blunt. The eyes stung. The same psalm, the same sentence, again and again. Yet, within this monotony lay a civic generosity. The scribes were cultural sentinels. By repeating the past, they made the future possible. They stitched a chain between eras with ink and vellum. The monastic scribe's world, therefore, is a study in how societies store themselves. Where Rome demanded purity to anchor its fortune, medieval monasteries demanded meticulous fidelity to texts to anchor memory. Both systems made heroes of repetition: the Vestal's ritual sweep and the scribe's steady hand are twin practices of preservation. Each is a discipline that translates small, repeated acts into the architecture of civilizations, sometimes with benevolent outcomes, sometimes with oppressive ones. So hold these images together. The Vestal sealed in a silent tomb to protect a city's fortune. The scribe at his desk, erasing and copying the names and ideas that will outlast empires. In both acts, the one legal and terrifying, the other painstaking and preservative. We see how human orders depend on tiny habitual labors. They are the dull, patient engines upon which history turns. We move forward now, leaving behind the sun-baked dread of the Roman Forum and the silent terror of the Campus Celeratus. Ahead lies another kind of stillness, another form of devotion. We step into the cloistered world of medieval Europe, where a new kind of servant waged a quieter war not with swords or shields, but with ink and parchment. Here, in the dim, echoing halls of monasteries, amid the smell of wax and old leather, lived the monastic scribe. The world outside these walls was chaos incarnate: lords feuding over muddy fields, peasants dying of plagues that came without warning, kingdoms collapsing as quickly as they rose. But inside the monastery, time slowed. It breathed differently. Within the scriptorium, the scribe's workshop, the world was reduced to one small desk, a red pen, and the endless sound of scratching ink. These scribes were not warriors or philosophers, yet they stood at the fragile edge between memory and oblivion. It was their patience, their ritual of slow, silent labor that preserved the wisdom of Greece, Rome, and early Christendom from slipping into darkness forever. The daily rhythm of a scribe's life was a symphony of discipline, cold, and repetition. The scriptorium was often the coldest room in the monastery, deliberately so. Fire was forbidden. Warmth, after all, was dangerous. Heat could dry and crack the parchment, and flame could devour centuries of knowledge in an instant. So the scribe sat in the freezing air, shoulders hunched, his breath fogging above the page. His fingers, stiff with cold, moved with aching precision as he coaxed letters onto parchment one by one. It was not creation that defined him, it was imitation. His life was the art of exactness. Before him lay a master textan, older manuscript, sometimes half-faded or worm-eaten, and his task was to copy it perfectly, letter for letter, word for word, over hundreds of pages. A single day's labor might yield only 2 or 3 completed pages. To finish a single gospel, or a philosophical treatise by Cicero or Seneca, could take a year or longer. Imagine that. One man, one pen, one text, for an entire year. No shortcuts, no distractions, no sense of progress. Just the steady rhythm of ink and time. But before the first stroke of the pen came the rituals of preparation. The parchment itself was a triumph of patience made from the skins of sheep, calves, or goats, soaked, stretched, scraped, and powdered with chalk until it was smooth enough to take ink. Then came the ruling, the careful marking of faint lines across each sheet using a stylus to ensure that every line of text stood straight and even. This, too, took hours silent, repetitive hours before even a single word could be written. The ink, meanwhile, was alive. Iron gall ink, the standard of the age, was temperamental, made from crushed oak galls mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. Some batches were too thin, some too thick. Over time, it could fade to brown or even corrode the page. The scribe was in a constant battle with his Tuzi's ink thickening midst, his pen nib wearing down, his hand cramping from the cold. The penknife, from which our modern word pen survives, was his closest companion. It wasn't a weapon, it was a maintenance tool. Every few minutes, the scribe paused to sharpen the tip of his quill, wipe away a blot, dip into the ink, and resume the steady rhythm. Scratch, lift, dip, scratch again. But above all, what haunted the scribe most was error. One mistake could destroy weeks of work and worse. In a holy text, it could be seen as an insult to God himself. A trembling hand, a tired eye, a stray blot, these were the ever-present enemies. And when the inevitable happened, when a mistake finally appeared, the correction was a ritual of penance. The scribe would take up a sharp knife or pumice stone and scrape away the error, grain by grain, layer by layer, praying he didn't tear the fragile parchment. Each correction was a tiny act of contrition, a physical reminder of imperfection in a world that demanded divine precision. To be a scribe was to live in a world of slowness and silence. Every day was the same. Cold fingers, aching back, dim candlelight, endless repetition. Yet, within this monotony, there was a quiet glory. For, in their endless copying, these men were doing something far greater than they realized. They were guarding civilization itself. Every book that survived the fall of Rome, every poem, every philosophy, every gospel survived because some half-frozen monk refused to stop writing. Through their silence, they carried the voices of Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Virgil into the future. Through their humility, they became immortal. The monastic scribe did not seek fame, yet his fingerprints are all over history. He was the bridge between the ancient and the modern world, the quiet heartbeat of human memory. And so, as the candle burns low and the last line is copied, we take our leave of the scriptorium. We step away from the cold stone walls, from the scratch of pen on parchment, and from the disciplined silence that once held the wisdom of ages together. Ahead lies a different kind of discipline, one of vanity, ritual, and absurdity. We move now into the glittering, perfumed world of 17th century Europe, where the measure of power was not the strength of one's hand or faith, but the height of one's hair. Our next chapter begins with the periwiga mountain of curls, starch, and etiquette, and the social labyrinth that turned the act of wearing a wig into a political performance of the highest order. We leave behind now the hushed devotion of the monastic scriptorium, those cloisters of ink, parchment, and patience end. Step into a world that smells not of dust and vellum, but of perfume and power. The year is the late 17th century. The light here is golden, filtered through clouds of scented powder, glinting softly off polished mirrors and powdered cheeks. We stand in the courts of Europe, shimmering and endlessly performative, where the measure of a man's worth was not written in conquest or coin, but in the height, curl, and composure of his hair. This was the age of the periwig. Towering, powdered monument to refinement and control. Yet beneath those shining curls lay an invisible architecture of obedience. The wig was more than an ornament. It was a system, a cage of vanity, built strand by strand. Heavy, hot, and absurdly delicate, turned its wearer into both the master and the prisoner of appearances. The grandest of all, the full-bottomed peruke, cascaded down the shoulders in silken waves, powdered to perfection. Each curl stiffened with starch until it seemed less hair than sculpture. To Dan, such a thing was to enter into servitude, but it was a servitude willingly embraced, because to reject the wig was to reject society itself. To go bareheaded was to be naked of rank, stripped of grace, invisible. And nowhere was this ritual more absurd or more revealing than in the etiquette of the hat. A gentleman, it was said, must remove his hat before a lady, a noble, or the king himself. A gesture meant to show respect when simple, now perilous. For how does one bow gracefully when one's skull is imprisoned beneath 3 feet of trembling curls, powdered to perfection and balanced like spun glass? Politeness became an acrobatic act. A hat lifted too high might snag on a curl. A clumsy motion might topple hours of labor. And the greatest humiliation of all, a glimpse of the sweating scalp beneath could end a reputation. So, new rules emerged. Perhaps one need not remove the hat entirely, just a touch of the brim, or a delicate 3-inch lift. Each motion rehearsed and codified. Each bow a calculation of hierarchy. At one court, a flick of the wrist sufficed. At another, a slow, deliberate nod was demanded. In a world where every glance, every breath was performance, a single misplaced gesture could spark an unspoken war. Picture, for a moment, the king's levee, that solemn morning ritual where nobles gathered to witness their sovereign's rising. The air is thick with perfume, powder, and quiet panic. Men stand stiff beneath their curls, necks aching, eyes sharp. Each greeting is a test. Too low a bow, and you seem desperate. Too shallow, and you risk offense. The court is a battlefield without swords fought, instead with angles of the wrist and degrees of deference. Under candlelight, this ballet of hats and curls unfolds endlessly. It is absurd, it is exhausting, and yet it is everything. The tyranny of the wig did not end with ceremony. At dinner, it hovered like a predator. Long curls dipped dangerously close to bowls of soup and sauces thick with grease. One careless motion, one droplet of oil, and a nobleman's hours of preparation dissolved into humiliation. So, new customs formed. Linen bibs to guard the shoulders, silk ties to restrain rebellious curls. Even the act of eating became a ritual, a slow, deliberate communion performed under the gaze of society itself. And then came travel. The wigs grew taller. The carriages did not. Coachmakers were forced to raise ceilings at great expense. Yet still the nobleman sat rigid. Bike straight-head bowed not in prayer, but in caution. Each journey a silent ordeal, a theater of discomfort endured for the sake of dignity. To suffer gracefully, after all, was the essence of refinement. The genius of the periwig was never in its beauty but in its exclusivity. Commoners wore wool and horsehair, their cheap imitations mocking the grandeur above. But true wigs crafted from human hair, perfumed, powdered, recurled daily, were ruinously expensive. They required money, servants, and time luxuries that only the elite could afford. It was fashion as warfare. The wig became a barrier, a wall of hair separating the born elite from the merely ambitious, to where one was to display not just style, but control over time, comfort, and body itself. To be noble, one had to suffer beautifully, and so the 17th century powdered itself into perfection. Identity became a costume. Status was worn, not earned. Power was measured in inches, not actions. The periwig was heavy, ridiculous. Divanon, it ruled Europe as silently and completely as any crown. And as the powdered air settles and the chandeliers dim, we leave this age of performance behind. The nobles bow, the hats rest, the wigs return to their boxers of starch and vanity. We turn now to another civilization, to one that sought not beauty, but permanence. We travel back to the blazing sun and solemn geometry of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, to the world of tombs, not of gold and myth, but of paperwork and precision. A place where eternity was built not of stone alone, but of scrolls, contracts, and the endless bureaucracy of the afterlife. We leave the frivolous anxieties of the powdered court and travel back once more, returning to the vast, unchanging deserts of ancient Egypt. Here, the true measure of a successful life was not the size of one's wig, but the sheer duration and complexity of one's tomb project. The meticulous construction and provisioning of an eternal resting place was not a sudden burst of activity. It was a slow, multi-decade bureaucratic undertaking, a testament to the power of patient, predictable planning. For any wealthy Egyptian official, the process of securing an afterlife began not with a grand religious decree, but with an exhausting series of legal and land transactions. The official first had to secure a desirable plot of landed dry, stable area in the desert necropolis, far from the unpredictable reach of the Nile flood. This required tedious negotiations with the local namarch and the royal land register, generating countless rolls of papyrus contracts, detailing boundaries, materials, and labor rights. The planning phase alone often consumed years, a quiet administrative effort to secure a piece of eternity. Once the site was acquired, the bureaucracy of construction management took over. The official had to sign contracts with a complex network of stonemasons, carpenters, sculptors, and painters. These contracts were not simple agreements. They were detailed, written guarantees, specifying the number of stones, the hours of labor, the purity of the pigment, and the precise timeline, all backed by complex payment schedules in grain, linen, or natron. A chief foreman's job was less about physical labor and more about ensuring that the endless paperwork remained accurate and that payments were delivered exactly on time, lest the workers simply cease their slow, steady labor. The construction itself was a study in slow, continuous effort. Unlike the swift creation of a temporary palace, the tomb was built to last forever. This meant every wall had to be perfectly plumbed, every stone fitted meticulously, and every passage measured against the divine standard of math. The artisans often worked at a glacial pace, as the official himself might not die for decades. The work was meant to be continuous, but never rushed. Years could pass in the simple, repetitive labor of carving a single chamber, or hauling limestone blocks up a sandy ramp. The monotony of the relief carving was particularly profound. Sculptors were required to cover the interior walls with scenes from the official's life, religious rituals, and offerings, all meant to sustain his Kalei force and Basol in the next world. The artists used a precise, grid-based system to ensure every figure, from the humble servant to the great official himself, adhered to the strict, unchanging visual conventions of the Egyptian style. Hour after hour, year after year, the sculptor slowly chipped away at the stone, rendering the same static, perfect forms of cows, fishing boats, and rows of offerings. It was the purest form of slow-motion portraiture, a life encapsulated in the tedious art of stone carving. But the complexity did not end with the stone. Once the construction was complete, the true bureaucratic burden began: the provisioning of the tomb. The eternal existence of the official depended on a continuous supply of food, drink, and other necessities. To ensure teas, the official would dedicate specific tracts of land or funerary estates in his will. The yield from these estates was perpetually earmarked to pay a dedicated staff of mortuary priests. The job of the mortuary priest was one of profound, unending boredom. Their sole duty was to visit the tomb on specific calendar days, often daily, weekly, or monthly, to recite the required prayers, and place fresh offerings of bread, beer, and meat before the official statue. The key was consistency and timing. The priest was paid not for the fervor of his faith, but for the mechanical accuracy of his delivery. Did he show up on the 10th day of the month? Did he recite the spell precisely? Was the bread fresh? This was a contract between the living and the dead, a slow, repetitive maintenance schedule for the soul. The system was so complex and detailed that it required a vast network of legal documents and written endowments to ensure the offerings continued for generations. The ultimate terror for the Egyptian elite was not death, but the bureaucratic failure of his mortuary endowment the moment when the land deeds were lost. The payments stopped, and the priests simply failed to show up, leaving the soul to starve in silent oblivion. We leave the eternal paperwork of the Egyptian tomb now, and move forward once more, back to the sun-drenched, yet cold, marble halls of the Roman Republic. We return to the ultimate anxiety of the Vestals, but this time we will examine the privileges and rules of public conduct that surrounded them, the slow, tedious ritual of their daily movement through the city, and the peculiar ways in which the Republic both honored and isolated them. We return now, for one final contemplation, to the disciplined lives of the Vestal Virgins of Rome. Until now, we have lingered on their terrifying responsibilities, the sacred flame that must never die, the vows that could never be broken, and the horrifying punishments that awaited those who failed. But the true weight of the Vestalist life was not only in what she could lose, it was also in what she was forced to carry, the endless, ceremonial burden of privilege. For while most Roman women were bound by domesticity and law, the Vestals were bound by something far stranger. They lived at the intersection of divinity and bureaucracy. Their every gesture transformed into a matter of state. They were at once worshipped and imprisoned, empowered and arrayed. Among their many peculiar privileges, one stood as the most striking: the right to possess a lictor. A lictor was no ordinary servant. He was a living symbol of the Roman state, a man who carried before him the facisa bundle of rods bound around an axe, the ancient emblem of power and punishment. Normally, such attendants walked before magistrates, consuls, and emperorsmen who held the power of life and death. But for a Vestal Virgin to have a lictor was to declare, before all of Rome, that she herself was a vessel of sacred authority, a being beyond the reach of common law. Whenever a Vestal left the quiet seclusion of the Atrium Vesta, it became an event, a moving ceremony. Perhaps she was traveling to make an offering at a distant shrine, or to testify in a public proceeding. Whatever the occasion, her movement through the city was slow, deliberate, and choreographed like ritual theater. The lictor would walk a few paces ahead, his voice cutting through the crowd, commanding silence. Citizens were expected to part, to stop mid-stride, to lower their eyes. The sounds of the marketplace, the shouting of vendors, the cries of children, the noise of carts would fall away as the Vestal passed, her white robes gliding through the quiet space she carried with her. For the citizens, it was awe. For the Vestal, it was exhaustion. Every step was a performance. Every breath, a silent prayer for composure. She had to move with perfect grace, never too fast, never too slow. Her eyes could not wander. Her face could not betray fatigue, fear, or joy. A walk that might take an ordinary Roman 5 minutes could stretch into 20 for her. A slow procession of deliberate stillness beneath the gaze of the entire city. Her privilege extended beyond the forum, into her modes of travel. When summoned to appear in court or attend ceremonies, she was permitted to ride in a covered carruaja, rare and extraordinary honor in ancient Rome, where even senators often went on foot. But the carriage was less a comfort and more a mobile sanctum, a physical reminder of her separation. The curtains were drawn tight, not merely to shield her from dust, but to shield her from the world itself. The Vestal was sacred, yes, but also untouchable. The people could watch her pass, but they could not speak to her. They could admire her robes, but they could not approach. Even her silence held legal weight. If a Vestal was called to court, she did not swear an oath. Her word alone was sacred enough. To lie would not only be a crime, it would be a cosmic fracture in the moral order of Rome. And then there was her most extraordinary and unsettling privilege: the power to pardon. If, By sheer coincidence, a Vestal encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution. She could, by her divine authority, grant him life. Instantly, no court appeal, no Senate vote. Her presence alone could overturn the state's decree of death. But this sacred gift carried a cruel condition. The meeting had to be purely accidental. If it was later proven that she had sought the man deliberately, that she had used her sacred power with intent, the mercy she granted would transform into sin and the punishment would fall upon her. This created a haunting paradox. The streets of Rome became a labyrinth of moral danger. A Vestal could not walk freely, for at any corner, an unexpected encounter might rewrite fate itself. Every outing required careful planning, precise timing, and near-paranoid awareness of what to the rest of Rome was mere coincidence for her was cosmic risk. To be a Vestal was to live beneath the constant weight of watchfulness. Her privileged carriage, the attendants, the silence of crowds were all meant to elevate her. But in doing so, they erased her humanity. She could not laugh in public, or gossip, or hurry to escape the rain. She could not reach for a lover's hand, or weep without permission. Her body belonged to the goddess, her time to the state. 30 years of this, 30 years of sacred stillness, 30 years of being a statue that breathed. When her service finally ended and she was released from her vows, few Vestals could remember how to live as ordinary women. Some married, most did not, for after decades of ritualized restraint, freedom itself felt profane. Their lives were paradoxes carved in ritual honor, without joy, independence without intimacy, reverence without rest. They stood at the heart of Roman civilization, and yet were cut off from it. Entirely silent pillars holding up the architecture of empire. And so, from this world of sacred stillness, we turn once more to movement, to the slow, metallic heartbeat that would come to define the rhythm of human life. We leave behind the marble courtyards of ancient Rome and descend into the clattering workshops of medieval Europe, where monks, blacksmiths, and tinkerers labored endlessly to capture something even the gods had never mastered: time itself. For the next chapter of this slow history concerns the invention of one of humanity's most tedious, most profound, and most transformative creations: the clock. It is a story not of lightning genius, but of patience, of gravity and gears, pendulums and pulleys, a story of how, by measuring time, humanity slowly came to be ruled by it. We move now not just across geography, but across the very structure of human perception itself, from the sacred flames of ancient Rome to the cold iron and smoke of medieval Europe. We shift from a world ruled by instinct and sunlight to one dominated by calculation and gears. Here, in the dim workshops and austere bell towers of the Middle Ages, humanity began its slow, grinding struggle against chaos itself. This was not a battle fought with swords or armies, but with gears, pendulums, and patience. The long, painstaking invention of the clock. Before mechanical timekeeping, time itself was more of a feeling than a measurement. It was marked by the gentle natural rhythm of the world, the slow arc of the sun, the tolling of the church bell, the drifting shadow on a sundial, or the steady dripping of a clepsydra, a water clock that counted the hours by loss. Time was imprecise, human, and forgiving. But as civilization grew more complex, that fluidity became a problem. Monks needed exact hours for prayer. Merchants demanded punctuality. Seafarers required precision to navigate oceans. The answer was not born from inspiration, it was forged painfully from 1,000 small failures. The earliest clockmakers faced a deceptively simple problem: not how to make the clock move, but how to make it stop. Gravity, once harnessed by weights and ropes, provided power in abundance but without regulation. It was wild, unstoppable. The weights would plummet, gears would spin violently, and the clock would devour itself in seconds. What humanity needed was not energy, but restraint, a mechanical heartbeat. That restraint arrived in the form of the verge and foliate escapement, a creation so crude, yet so brilliant, that it single-handedly birthed mechanical time. Imagine it: a vertical rod called the verge, tipped with 2 small metal plates ballets, sangled precisely to catch the teeth of a rotating crown wheel. Resting above the verge was a horizontal bar, the foliate, with two tiny sliding weights at its ends. Together, they formed a delicate dance between gravity and resistance. As the heavy weight pulled the gears downward, the crown wheel's jagged teeth tried to spin uncontrollably, but one of the pallets stopped it, catching a tooth, forcing the verge to twist. That twist released one side only for the other pallet to immediately catch the next tooth. Catch, stop, release. Catch, stop, release. The chaos of gravity was tamed into rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, dot. It was not just a sound, it was civilization's first heartbeat of order. But this order came at a price. Every tooth of every wheel had to be cut and filed by hand. Every pivot had to turn with microscopic precision. A single rough surface or uneven gear could throw the clock's rhythm into chaos. These early timepieces were rarely accurate. They could drift by minutes, even hours, in a single day. Each one had to be manually corrected by the position of the sun, forcing its creator to bow daily to the very nature he sought to dominate. And so began the clockmaker's lifelong war against his three relentless enemies: friction, wear, and imperfection. Friction was the invisible thief of time. Every turning wheel, every sliding pallet, every trembling pin generated resistance. It dulled the rhythm, slowed the motion, and whispered decay into every revolution. To fight it, clockmakers became part machinist, part alchemist. They polished metal until it gleamed like mirrors, soaked axles in oils rendered from animals, and labored endlessly to keep dust and soot at bay. A speck of grit could silence an entire mechanism. Then came wear, the slow, inevitable erosion of precision. Each tick was not merely a sound, it was a wound. The constant catching of the escapements slowly shaved down the metal teeth, imperceptibly at first, until the rhythm faltered and time itself began to limp. A clock, even at its best, was a dying organism, always slipping toward disorder. Clockmakers were its physicians, forever performing surgery to keep it alive. And above all, hovered the uncertainty of metal itself. Medieval metallurgy was as much superstition as science. One poorly tempered gear, one unseen impurity in the brass, and the machine could seize or crumble after months of work. There were stories of craftsmen who wept when a single cracked cog destroyed half a year's labor. Every clock was both a triumph and a tragedy, a fragile monument to human persistence. In these dim workshops, filled with the hiss of files, the hum of grinding wheels, and the faint smell of oil and soot, the clockmaker's bench became a sacred altar to precision. These men were not just artisans, they were philosophers of motion, wrestlers with the invisible. Each swing of the foliate was a statement of defiance, that the human mind could impose order upon the universe's endless chaos. Over centuries, their slow, stubborn perfection changed everything. The mechanical clock became the pulse of the modern world. It disciplined the monastery, the marketplace, and eventually the factory floor. The concept of punctuality, a word that barely existed before, became a moral virtue. Humanity no longer moved with the sun. It moved with a clock. Yet, it is worth remembering that this new precision was built on the bones of monotony, on thousands of unseen hands that spent lifetimes filing gear teeth, wiping oil, and listening to the quiet, relentless heartbeat of time. The great ticking world of modern civilization began not with explosions or revolutions, but with the gentle, stubborn persistence of men who refused to let gravity win. And now, having witnessed the birth of order, we turn to its complete opposite, to chaos incarnate. From the cold precision of iron gears, we return to flesh, pleasure, and madness. From the quiet workshop, we step into the marble halls of Imperial decadence, to a young Roman emperor whose life was a fever dream of excess, unpredictability, and ruin. His name was and his story, unlike the measured tick of the clock, was a rapid descent into chaos itself. We leave behind the cold, disciplined workshops of the clockmakers and the exacting, measured rhythm of mechanical time, and we return to the heart of the Roman Empire, but to a man whose life defied all order, discipline, and expectation. Emperor where the Vestal Virgins preserved Rome through solemn sacrifice. Caligula sought to redefine the city through ceaseless excess. indulgence, and spiritual audacity, a continuous, slow-motion campaign of chaos that astonished, horrified, and exhausted the rigidly structured Roman elite. Born various avitos passiones, a Syrian by Heritz, Elagabalus was thrust upon the Roman throne at the tender age of 14. A puppet, elevated by the cunning and ambition of his mother and grandmother, his reign, lasting a mere 4 years, became a masterclass in converting supreme power into unpredictable, deliberate indulgence. He did not seek glory on the battlefield, nor fame through civic reform. Instead, his obsession was singular: the creation of a personal, eternal spectacle of pleasure, ritual, and luxurious excess. At the core of this spectacle was the sun god a foreign deity represented by a black conical stone, which Elagabalus, as high priest in Emesa, Syria, had long revered. Upon ascending the throne, he committed his first audacious act: to place this foreign god above the pantheon of Roman divinities, including Jupiter himself. The sacred stone was transported to Rome and enshrined in a vast, ornate temple on the Palatine Hill. Senators, priests, and magistrates were compelled to participate in rituals they neither comprehended nor respected, hours of chanting elaborate sacrifices, and foreign rites conducted under the burning sun, all meticulously observed by the emperor as a slow, grand display of devotion and domination. Every day in Elagabalus' court was a carefully orchestrated, tedious performance of ritual, spectacle, and spiritual transgression. The emperor cloaked himself in silks and gold, adorned with diadems. Transforming from a Roman sovereign into an Eastern priest, he performed endless sacrifices, ranging from bulls to exotic beasts, often requiring the presence of Rome's highest officials, forced into ceremonial submission for hours at a time. The meticulous, slow pace of these rituals created a suffocating atmosphere of awe, irritation, and underlying fear, a reminder that authority and absurdity were inseparable in his court. But his excess was not confined to religion. His banquets became exercises in deliberate, tedious spectacle. Imagine attending one of these dinners: trays of 600 ostrich heads, mountains of nightingale tongues, pearls ground into food and wine not for taste, but as a slow, visible proof of wealth, waste, and audacity. Each detail was a test, a calculated infliction of discomfort upon his guests. Chairs would collapse, cushions deflate ceilings would release overwhelming showers of rose petals, suffocating diners in a fragrant, terrifying avalanche, all meticulously timed and executed to maximize bewilderment. Elagabalus' personal life was a mirror of his public chaos. He flouted Roman marital customs, cycling through short-lived wives and openly taking male partners, whom he ceremoniously referred to as his husbands. One of his most infamous acts was marrying a male slave, Heracles, in a full imperial ceremony, complete with public display and ritual deference, challenging every societal and religious norm. The emperor's court was populated not by experienced administrators, generals, or senators, but by dancers, acrobats, barbers, and entertainers, chosen solely for their capacity to amuse or indulge him. Governance became a secondary concern, overshadowed by a slow, relentless pursuit of spectacle and indulgence. Even Rome itself bore the mark of his The streets and palaces reeked of foreign incense, vibrated with elaborate silk processions, and thrummed with the anxiety of citizens who feared both divine wrath and imperial caprice. The treasury, once a tool of statecraft, was drained not by wars or public works, but by the slow, relentless demands of ritual, luxury, and ceremonial excess. Pearls, gold, exotic animals, silk robes, and impossibly complex banquets became instruments of power, each act meticulously calculated to unsettle and awe. For Rome's traditional elite men who revered discipline, order, and predictability, the emperor's every act was intolerable. The chaos of Elagabalus' life was slow, constant, and inescapable. A 4-year-long performance that tested the boundaries of patience, decorum, and power itself. His reign ended as dramatically as it had unfolded. Assassinated at the age of 18 by the Praetorian Guard, thrown into the Tiber River, and systematically erased from the annals of history. He had attempted to outrun the measured rhythm of Roman tradition through ceaseless indulgence, and yet the inexorable, slow tide of order reclaimed the city he sought to remake. And now, having witnessed the extremes of human indulgence and disorder, we shift once more. We leave behind the silken chaos of Imperial Rome and return to the disciplined, painstaking artistry of the monastery. This time, we focus on a figure of quiet patience and meticulous detail. The illuminator, the artist responsible for the most exquisite, slow, and painstaking embellishment of the manuscript, the final act of concentrated, deliberate beauty that would ensure the wisdom of the ages survived in color, line, and light. We have traveled through the anxious, vigilant lives of the Vestal virgins, the quiet cunning of the Egyptian scribes, the tedious, social tyranny of the French and the chaotic, sensuous excess of Emperor Caligula. And now, as our long, deliberate journey nears its conclusion, we return once more to the serene, hushed halls of the monastic scriptorium, focusing on the illuminator, the monk, whose painstaking artistry was the final, most luxurious, and most fragile act in the preservation of ancient knowledge. While the scribe labored to ensure the text itself was flawless, the illuminator's role was to make the manuscript a visual, almost sacred masterpiece, worthy of the divine wisdom it contained. This stage of creation was by far the most expensive, labor-intensive, and demanding. A slow, deliberate devotion requiring unbroken focus, an unshakable hand, and a patience that verged on ascetic meditation. The first task was the preparation of pigments. Unlike modern paints, medieval pigments came from obscure, natural, and often extraordinarily costly sources. The renowned ultramarine blue, for example, originated from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone mined in the remote mountains of Afghanistan and transported over vast distances at immense expense. Grinding this hard, precious mineral into a fine, workable powder demanded hours of painstaking, repetitive effort. The finest pigments were handled by apprentices to preserve the master's delicate hands, leaving the illuminator free to focus on composition, precision, and subtlety. The gold and silver used in illumination, the very origin of the term, illuminated manuscript, presented an even greater challenge. Gold leaf was extraordinarily fragile, so thin that a single breath, a careless touch, or a sudden draft could ruin it. Each sheet had to be applied to the page with painstakingly prepared Gilderesque glue and polished with a smooth burnisher, sometimes a carefully chosen stone or even the tooth of a dog, to achieve a mirror-like reflective finish. Every micro-mistake was not just a visual error but a financial one. Months of labor and rare materials could be lost in an instant. With pigments prepared, the illuminator began the act of creation itself, working not in broad sweeps, but in microscopic detail. The focus was often the initial capital letter of a chapter or verse, which was transformed into an entire miniature world. Swirling knotwork, twisting vines, fantastical creatures, or tiny religious tableau. A single initial could demand more effort than copying 24 pages of text, as every brushstroke was a calculated act of precision. The work was governed by light and silence. The illuminator required the brightest, most stable daylight, often working by a window for only those hours. When the sun was just right, rendering his working schedule rigid and entirely dictated by the slow natural arc of the sun across the sky. Imagine the extreme concentration demanded by painting the tiniest detail, the glimmer of a saintess, the delicate veins of a mythical leaf, or the fine filigree on a garment. One slip could ruin weeks of labor by the scribe, days of pigment preparation by apprentices, and hours of gilding. The illuminator existed in a state of absolute focus, a form of meditative devotion in which each movement of the hand, each brushstroke, was both prayer and craft, the slow manifestation of a sacred duty. The work was often solitary. Unlike scribes, who shared the scriptorium isse communal tablis, the illuminator often worked in a separate, cleaner space, shielded from dust, ink splatters, and the constant movement of other monks. This isolation underscored the preciousness of his craft. The borders, miniatures, and full-page illustrations he created were the final, crowning act of a manuscript, marking major sections and transforming the practical into the sublime. Perhaps the greatest challenge was longevity. The illuminator had to master the chemistry of his materials, understanding how pigments reacted with parchment, how they faded in light, and how they would endure the inevitable friction of handling over centuries. Egg whites, animal glues, pigment thickness, burnishing technique all were part of a deliberate, repetitive process aimed at preserving beauty against time itself. Even the most meticulous work remained vulnerable. Gold leaf could wear, vibrant blues could dull, and delicate illustrations could crumble under human carelessness. The act of illumination was as much an exercise in slow preservation as in creation a continuous, prayer-like investment in the endurance of knowledge. In this way, the illuminator's contribution extended far beyond mere artistry. His labor preserved not just the text, but the human effort, the devotion, and the intellectual heritage of generations. Each manuscript was a testament to the slow, repetitive, and painstaking craft that underpinned civilization, a fragile, glimmering bridge across centuries. And so, our long exploration of tediousness, discipline, and slow, precise labor draws to a close. We have traversed the silent vigilance of the Vestals, the meticulous cunning of Egyptian scribes, the oppressive social performances of the periwig, and the chaotic excess of we end where we began. In the quiet, concentrated work of those who shaped history not through grandeur or violence, but through persistent, careful, and repetitive dedication. The greatest endurance is found not in sudden heroism, but in the steady rhythm of daily labor. The architects of history were not merely kings, generals, or emperors, but the silent, patient scribes and artisans who, with steady hands and unwavering focus, created order from chaos, beauty from tedium, and permanence from the fleeting moment. Thank you for accompanying me on this long, meditative journey through time. Your mind, like the illuminator's brush, remains steady, and may your rest be as deep, deliberate, and restorative as the centuries-old manuscripts we have witnessed. Good night.